Okay, we can start.
Good morning to everybody. I'm Milan Ježovic. I'm Senior Fellow at MESA 10, and I'd like to welcome you to the workshop which we are running within the project of University Debate. This is a project which is implemented jointly with our partners from Belgrade, from SEAS, and I'm glad that I can welcome to our broadcast Anja Petkovic, who is managing the program on behalf of SEAS in Belgrade. Today, we are honored to have among us Marko Savkovič, who is the program director at Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence, and who is going to share with us his thoughts on the Western Balkans. We are, of course, eager to hear what he has to say, and I would like to encourage the students to take this session not only as a lecture, but really as an interactive discussion. And I'm hopeful that you will ask a number of questions which will be very difficult for Marko to elaborate on. With that, I'm passing the baton to Belgrade, to Anja. Just one technical remark. Please be aware that we are broadcasting in Hangout, and the broadcast is based on sound. So wherever the microphone picks up a noise, then it is broadcasted into all the stations. So when the lecturer from Belgrade speaks, try to listen to him. And when you have questions, I'm sure that Marko will stop and will give you enough opportunities to ask questions. Then please do use the space that he creates for the discussion and for the questions. Anja, please, you have the floor. And thank you very much for everybody for coming today.
Okay, thank you, Milan, so much. And I would also like to thank everyone for participating this morning. I would like to introduce Marko Savkovič. As Milan mentioned, he is a program director at the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence. Today's topic of the lecture is going to be Crisis of the Liberal Consensus for Western Balkans. I think it's important to highlight that Marko is also a member of the working group dedicated to Chapter 31 of Serbia's European integration process within the National Convent on the EU. So I think that he is practically one of the people who can speak about the Serbian EU integration process. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Marko Savkovič.
Good morning to all. I hope you can hear me well. Looking at the faces of colleagues in Podgorica, what are they saying? Can you hear me? No? They're saying they cannot hear me. Maybe I can use that microphone.
Everybody hears you, but I have muted the microphones.
We can hear you very well.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, well, of course.
This is something new for me, I have to say. Reminds me a bit of Eurovision Song Contest. Anyways, really happy to be with you here this morning. Being the only speaker, I was hoping to share the floor with a colleague from NATO Military Liaison Office. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So I will have to keep you busy for more than an hour. Let's hope that will be interesting enough. As Anja has said, I direct programs at the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence. It is a think tank which has been running since 2003.
Serbia, we cannot hear you. 1, 2, 3. Nie, funguje to. Nie, tu je Serbia Belgrade. Môžem ho... Serbia has disconnected for some reasons. Belgrade has disconnected. Všetky idú. Skús je napísať, prosím ťa. Asi možno, alebo rovno zavolať, či? No, možno si... Nechcem to stopnúť.
Ukrajině, o Moldova, že dojde Slováče.
U nich je nejaký problém, lebo vidíš, všetci ostatní sa hýbu, a vidíš, už vypadli. Už ide. Už sa pripája.
Povedz im, že Belgrade vypadol.
Oni vedia, ja som počkaj.
No, oni vedia.
Belgrade is turned off, but now I think he'll be back for just 1 minute.
Yes, I can hear you, but you got disconnected from the broadcast.
Už sú tu, toto sú.
Yeah. Okay, we will let everybody know to wait. Super, ciao. Povedz im, že sa vypli a že čakáme na nich.
Serbia, Belgrade has disconnected and we wait for them. Just for wait for a second. Už sú tam, len nemajú asi Serbia, Belgrade. Sú tam dvakrát. Okay, welcome back.
Yes. Good to be back. I hope that we are back.
Okay, we are hearing you good, so you can continue.
Okay, thank you. So, to skip this long introduction, very happy to be with you this morning. I was asked to present or to speak on Western Balkans, Kosovo, and NATO, in that order. So I thought about giving a title to my presentation. I'm calling it Crisis of Liberal Consensus in and for Western Balkans, and I will explain why it is in and for. I will start by explaining what I understand under Western Balkans as a term. I will continue by speaking on what I understand as liberal consensus. Then about the crisis of that particular consensus, its implications, and the ways to overcome it, especially what happens if there are no ways to overcome it. So I would like to begin by saying what is Western Balkans. I think this is important for given our audience, and ultimately it's a question that I ask myself all the time as a researcher. Is Western Balkans a geographical region or a political construct? And most definitely, it is a political construct. Geographical region as such, there is Balkans. And when I was in elementary school, we knew only about the Balkans. However, something needed to be thought up in order to define this post-Yugoslav space minus Slovenia plus Albania. Albania had to be somehow bundled together with successor states of former Yugoslavia. And when you look at it, even today, you could say that Albania in its own right is slightly different than this so-called post-Yugoslav space. But on the other hand, over years of political reforms and changes, so many similarities have have been found or established between our respective societies. It is also interesting to comment on whether Croatia constitutes Western Balkans or not. The fact that it is a very political term speaks for itself, since many of Croatia leaders today would like to think of themselves as not being part of Western Balkans. So as long as they were striving towards European Union and NATO membership, they were Western Balkans. The moment they got in, they are not anymore. How does Western Balkans compare to other regions of Europe? I would say that to all of our participants from Western Balkans, all of you in the audience, it is considerably poorer. It is not that well connected. You could argue that it is a region on the periphery. But on the other hand, it is a central region when you look at its relative geopolitical and geostrategic position. It is neither big or economically strong. We have participants from Slovakia. Entire GDP of Western Balkan countries, so Western Balkan 6, is smaller than GDP of Slovakia, for instance. But it is diverse. When I say it's not big, all of Romania has approximately the same number of citizens as all of the Western Balkan 6 combined. When I say it's diverse in every possible way you can imagine. Actually, its diversity is one thing with which it could contribute tomorrow to the European Union, which has this interesting motto, unity through or in diversity. What are the defining features of Western Balkans today? For most of its part, it's a post-conflict region. It has gone through successive wars in the 1990s. And these wars still, unfortunately, define big part of reality in which we live. It is a post-authoritarian region with, again, differences between parts of former Yugoslavia and Albania. Today, it is a region which is at best constituted of flawed democracies or partly free societies, as the Freedom House denomination suggests. At worst, it is a region of countries sliding towards autocracy. It has transitioned as a region to market economy with significant structural problems. I will speak about this more later. When I say liberal consensus, we could argue with the term liberal today. I hope that you are well aware of all the difficulties and the challenges and misagreements over what today constitutes liberal democracy. But this was the defining feature of the strategy. It was both the defining feature of regimes which tried to influence Western Balkans. And at least on paper, this was something that Western Balkan societies themselves were striving to post-2000, to become liberal democracies and market economies fully integrated into the West, meaning NATO and EU as the best existing type of order that was available. Interesting enough, integration was seen as this universal cure, this panacea for all the illnesses our societies were faced with. And I have to say that this is slightly changing with the rise of Euroscepticism and similar ideologies. It is a question of what were drivers of this integration. Was it a grand political design? Since enlargement is seen as one of two most successful policies of European Union. For instance, for the EU, there are probably two most successful policies. One is the internal market or the accomplishment of the internal market, and the other is enlargement. When you look at the transformative effect that enlargement has had. And similar can be said for NATO. Enlargement is the ultimate proof that you are appealing to others, that you're interesting to others as a political entity, as a political, in case of EU, supranational organization, or in case of NATO, military and political organization and alliance. Today, one could argue that enlargement is driven primarily by geopolitical and security concerns to fill in the space, since in international relations there is no such thing as vacuum, to fill in the space before so-called third actors, which are understood first and foremost as Russia, then as Turkey, China, and other competing models, fill that space with their own ideologies and suggestions on how to govern. There are regional implications of this crisis of liberal consensus and internal for each of the societies. I would first ask the question of when exactly did it all go wrong? And let me start by saying that selling the enlargement as a policy was never easy, following the so-called Big Bang enlargement in 2004. It has become even less so when Romania and Bulgaria became members. Following 2007 enlargement, we have seen a rise in the difficulty of the conditions that were posed in front of each and every aspiring country. And enlargement policy of the European Union has changed. It has become more complex. Serbia today has to conclude negotiations in 35 negotiating chapters. Each of these chapters cover certain aspect of political life. Other countries as well in our region, it's Montenegro that's probably the farthest on its road towards membership, while we have other countries that are either candidates or potential candidates. What made the situation more difficult for Western Balkans? Was it the global economic crisis? I would say probably. It took the West a full decade to recover, with some key countries never really recovering when you look at the average salary on or the standard of living. Was it the migrant crisis? Most definitely. Migrant crisis shook this foundation of the European project, this underpinning. It affected freedom of movement. It affected the way how liberal democracies looked at the outside world. And it definitely opened deep fissures within the European Union. Especially for Serbia and other countries that are en route of migrants trying to reach Western Europe, we have seen how difficult it was with some of the countries deciding not to accept European Union's quota policy, and up to this day, this is one of the, I would say, most contested policies within the European Union. Then following 2014 and more assertive Russia came these competing models from both within and outside the European Union. When I say within, I think of countries that are embracing kind of more sovereign approach to democracy as such, countries that see some of the policies that are agreed today in Brussels as contradictory to their national interest. And when I speak of countries that are outside of the European Union, again, I first and foremost think of the three countries that offer some sort of models. I say competitive. I don't think that they are, of course, superior than the model that was offered by European Union, but they are intriguing to elites across this region. One positive development, one positive regional development has been NATO enlargement and accession to NATO of different countries. Croatia and Albania in 2009, and we are now probably looking at North Macedonia acceding by the end of this year, if not early 2020. One case in point that shows that there is no liberal consensus anymore is Kosovo. For a number of reasons, and of course, through questioning, I would be happy to engage in discussion over this. Kosovo came to be as a sort of a product of liberal consensus that existed in the 1990s. However, many of the promises that were given to Kosovo authorities or to people in Kosovo in the first decade of its independence never came to be. And when we listen today of the possibilities of final deal between Belgrade and Pristina, or Serbia and Kosovo, it is clear that there are serious disagreements within the European Union, between the principal countries. Also, it is clear that not all countries, or only a few to be precise, encourage further enlargement. Well, a wake-up call for most of us was a visit by French Minister for Europe only 2 weeks ago. Sorry. There are also implications within our societies of this crisis that are, I would say, perhaps even more important. They have longer reaching consequences. With the more distant membership perspective, we have seen a weakening of institutions. We have seen a phenomenon of state capture. I believe that many of you have heard of this. And we have witnessed autocratic tendencies. They are not new, but they are becoming more prominent as the years go by. One reinforces the other. The farther we are from European Union, the more difficult it is to engage in reforms, because more or less all of the reforms that we have initiated as a society, speaking of Serbia's experience, are within this European integration context. It is very difficult today to imagine, which speaks of probably fragility and speaks of capacities within our societies. It is very difficult to imagine a reform without it being done within the context of European integration. Another topic that is well known to all of you, brain drain, it has accelerated. It was slowed down a bit in the last decade. Now it has accelerated again. And it's not only brain drain. I mean, the best way to describe it today is people leaving, literally. And with the announced possibility, I'm still not sure whether this is a law or a legal provision, that Germany will be opening its border from 1st of January 2020 for a lot of professions from the Western Balkans. This people leaving will accelerate once again. I would argue that this is the single greatest challenge to the region as a whole. It is a societal challenge. It is a security challenge. We don't really have a defined strategy of how to address it. And it's happening quicker than we can come up with a strategy that would be sustainable, feasible, and all these things. But why is this happening? I mean, when you look at some of the experiences of countries of Central and Eastern Europe and how their economies have developed and how quickly they caught up with the rest or with the West, and we look at some of the indicators, when we look at inequality, few of the students realize Serbia today is one of the 3 most unequal societies in Europe. If you look at Gini index, which sits somewhere around 38. If you look at people at risk of poverty, close to 40% of population in Serbia is close to at risk, being at risk of poverty or living in poverty, 40%. When you look at unemployment and employment rates, the region has been lagging behind. Growth has been uneven and insufficient. Example of Poland as a country that probably today has one of the most thriving European economies, and its comparison with, for instance, Ukraine, its immediate neighbor, in 1989, and where is Poland 30 years later, with average salary and GDP that has grown for 300%. It's almost incomparable. And this is what gets us into this risk. I at least observe it here in Belgrade, which is the risk of pronounced Euroscepticism, which may sound strange to some other countries that are not even close to beginning negotiations. But for instance, as a country that is, if everything falls into place, years from being an EU member, we have an approval rate of the EU, and we have number of percentage of respondents who are in favor of European Union membership below 50%. That is something that after almost 20 years of going through transition must worry us all. I'm at my final slide because I don't want to keep this too long of a story. I really would like to hear your questions as well. The ways to overcome this situation, which is again impossible to depict in half an hour. I mean, we would really need to do individual studies case studies of each of the countries involved in the enlargement integration processes. First, there will be no EU enlargement before 2027. And I think this has been more or less, by now this is more or less clear to all of us who are involved in these processes. Simply, there is the multi-annual financial framework. We didn't manage to get in for the wished 2025 deadline, so we are now looking at the next horizon or the next perspective. Regional cooperation, it would take probably another half an hour of your time, but one of the most important processes right now in the region is Berlin process. And Berlin process started in 2014 when it was clear that there will be no speedy enlargement following Croatia's accession, that there will be no speedy enlargement of any of the remaining countries in Western Balkans, either to EU or NATO. And it was a German initiative, and it was, and it still is, a very interesting initiative because it's very wide. It tackles economy issues, it tackles issues of development, and so on and so forth. One of the most intriguing for me personally ideas that came out of the Berlin process so far are those ideas that are related to mutual recognition of diplomas, ideas that are related to mobility, some ideas that are related to infrastructure, because infrastructure is in a poor state and we do need serious investment in order to establish better connection between our countries. And another idea that is still in the works, which is a regional economic area, which should be understood not as a replacement for European integration, but as sort of a way to, a sort of a shortcut to it. What has been EU's approach? And I think this needs to be deliberated at great length as well. Is it today merit-based, or is it again firmly in the hands of member states and their inner political considerations? Electorates within the member states are predominantly against enlargement of the European Union. And this is something that we have to keep in mind all the time. When I say merit-based, I look at the example of North Macedonia, which today is at risk of once again not getting the date or not getting the start of opening of negotiations with the EU, which is of paramount importance for further democratization in that country. NATO enlargement has provided additional security guarantees, even to Serbia, as a country that is military neutral. In its draft national security strategy, there are a few sentences that depict accession of Croatia and Albania and potential accession of North Macedonia as something positive, something that would contribute to regional stability. The reason why this is so is probably that region today experiences the lowest level of trust since the wars of the 1990s. Which brings me to the question, can we find ways to overcome this situation, this crisis from within, with our own forces, by relying on our own forces? Trust is definitely an issue. We have bilateral disputes that are complex. Again, case of North Macedonia and Greece should be a sort of a guiding example and should provide a sort of positive momentum to the rest. The region has this reputation, and it is seen from outside as somewhat backward, somewhat unsuccessful. And this has to change. but there are two preconditions. We would need elites that care for this region, that share a sense of belonging to it, which is again kind of problematic because, as I said, this is a political construct first and foremost. And we need a different approach. We cannot continue looking at our own belly buttons. We have to be aware that whatever we do here here in Belgrade, Sarajevo, in Podgorica, wherever, has regional implications. I would like to stop here. And if there are questions, I would be happy to answer to any of them. Thank you.
Okay, now you can ask questions. I would just ask everyone to mute their mics, and only the ones who are going to ask questions unmute the mic and then ask the question.
We have a question.
We can hear you.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. Thank you, Mr. Marko, for deliberating this topic. I would like to ask, since we have this trust issues, right, on the Western Balkans, and our situation with the economy and also with democracy is not very great, but we still try to enter to the EU and the NATO as well. So can we see that is the EU our only alternative, or do we have something else that we can change internally in the Western Balkans so that we can access to the EU eventually, or we can do something else, or is it our only alternative? Thank you very much.
Okay, are there any more questions? Maybe we can get two more. So, Slovakia. Okay, if there are no more questions, Marko can answer this one, and maybe someone will have more questions later, additional questions later.
Hello?
We can hear you.
We have a question. So you were talking about Serbia and Kosovo problem and joining the EU. My question is, how do you think is it possible for Serbia to have more than 50%, 60% of people wishing to join the EU? Because at this rate, when I was looking at the polls, more than 50% people were for the EU, but that's when you ask people, when you don't ask people about Kosovo. When you ask them, are you for the EU with the recognition of Kosovo, that approval rate drops significantly. So if Kosovo still remains unresolved, we cannot join the EU because of the territorial issues. But if it gets recognized in any of the proposed shapes so far, I suppose that a lot of people in Serbia will revert, will not stop supporting the EU, the Serbia going into the EU. So do you have similar views, or do you see any way in which the citizens of Serbia would support joining of the Serbia in the EU in more than 50%, while at the same time solving the Kosovo problem?
Okay, I hope that you can hear me all well. Thank you for both questions. Is the EU the only alternative? I would say that taking into account the level of trade, of exchange, of where do people look to when they look for more successful, richer, better organized societies. I'm answering this from a very, very, I would say, Serbia-centric perspective. I would say that for my country, not really. There are, I mean, we could try to think of alternatives, and I think that's a useful exercise. It's an interesting exercise. But when you look at it realistically from every single perspective, I mean, there is a professor has this joke saying that if our countries don't enter the EU, people most definitely will, because they will leave for European Union societies. So, and that is happening. I mean, it's happening all the time. Now, whether we can think of certain, let's say, changes to the European model that would be more topical to Western Balkans, that would be more akin to what we are used in Western Balkans. Now, that would be, I would say, also problematic to one point, because we need the rules of the game. When you ask citizens why do they think of European Union as a better way of, they speak of normalcy, of normal life. This is sometimes very difficult to translate to colleagues who are living in those exact societies. I had such a situation where I was trying to explain. I mean, in our languages we say normalan život, a normal life, right? I mean, and there was this Dutch colleague who was looking at me, didn't understand what I was saying, because for them normal life is normal life. I mean, there is no other life, which means more or less rule of law, and I think that is something that would greatly improve quality of life in our societies. If we are looking for potential alternative models, we first need to ask ourselves, are there such models on the horizon? Russia hasn't really offered an alternative model. It has its own, let's say, competing, but it's not really competitive, political, military, economic alliance. But it's, for instance, no real alternative for Serbia. Because if you decide to go that way, you would be giving up on free trade agreements that you have with European Union. So, I mean, simply when you look at the trade, when you look at people interactions, when you look at where you're getting your technology from, when you look at where you're getting your ideas from, it is still pretty much, I mean, EU runs the show, in a way, to say it in a very American way. It still runs the show. But the problem is, its appeal, it lost a bit of its appeal. It lost it with the migrant crisis. It lost it with economic crisis, with the rise of this populism, which is also described by many different ways. Although there are some, I would say, Western Balkans peculiarities that we could use, that we could keep. I mean, some of the concepts that we import are not that new to us. To us who were part of former Yugoslavia. I mean, former Yugoslavia was, with all its problems and issues, a bit of a European Union in a small scale. When you look at some of the concepts with regard to education, for instance, my organizations recently did, there is this dual education model, Duales Ausbildung, that is imported from Germany, Austria, and so forth. I mean, we had a kind of similar model in 1970s, 1980s. I mean, it's interesting. From time to time, you find out something that was done before, and then you ask yourselves, couldn't we somehow? But then that's the question of our capacity, of our political, if you will, class capacity to undertake complex reforms. It's a question for all of you as students. I mean, tomorrow, don't take in everything without necessary criticism. You know, look at everything with critical eyes. At least this is what I'm trying to do. But whether there is a feasible alternative this moment, I would say no. I would say no. On Kosovo and Serbia, well, it's of course the most complex issue. I would say that we have seen a change with the possibility, I would argue that Serbia's leadership has hinted that it would be willing to recognize in exchange for border corrections. And I think that by now this is more or less clear to all of us who are observing the process closely. And this has changed the paradigm in a way. It has attracted the attention of United States, that are the most interested actor right now to see mutual recognition. And when you hear their representatives, what they are saying, they always say, we would like to see an agreement with mutual recognition at its core. This, of course, makes life a bit more difficult for elites in Serbia, because they have been, I would say, selling to their public the story that Serbia will be able to enter European Union without recognizing. This model enabled Serbia to pass on big part of its sovereignty to Kosovo, to Pristina, especially with regard the north of Kosovo, which is ethnically Serb, more compact, and so on. And since the break of the dialogue, or the failure of the Brussels dialogue in late 2015, and it was quite clear following the decision by Kosovo's Constitutional Court in December 2015 that association of civil municipalities will remain this bridge too far, that we will have to engage in, as Americans like to say, creative discussion. And I think that where we are right now is the result of this creative discussion. Although border corrections, partition, whatever you call it, it has been part of Serbian mainstream thinking for years, I would even say decades. It's nothing new. What is new is apparent American willingness to talk about it. And they are the ones who are now in many ways driving this process. But it's also important to note that there is no consensus in either of the societies right now with regards to any resolution. I mean, the only consensus in Serbia probably would be some kind of frozen conflict, and the only consensus in Kosovo would be full recognition, etc., etc. So we are still far from the agreement. The moment you see tabloids changing headlines or changing the ways how they report on Kosovo, which is always negative, on Albanians, which is always negative and derogatory, and on the process itself, that will be a sure sign that something is changing, that the government is trying hastily in the last moment to change the public opinion, because you need to change the public opinion in order to make this deal, whatever the deal is, sustainable. The other approach, the so-called German approach, was let's wait and see. Let's continue the normalization process. Let's continue with the agreements and their implementation. And problem for Kosovo, I would say, with this approach was that it didn't guarantee recognition. It didn't guarantee UN membership. It didn't bring any guarantees whatsoever. This is a complex process with implications for regional security, and it's highly doubtful that it will end with an agreement in 2019. And if it ends with an agreement, it's highly doubtful that that agreement would be implemented.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Yes, we actually have.
Hello, I have one question. So, what are your views about Serbia's accession to the NATO, and will the perception ever change? Will Serbia ever be for NATO? And if not, can we see a possibility that maybe Serbia's politicians can somehow influence the politicians from Republika Srpska and Bosnia and Herzegovina to support Bosnia's path to NATO? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think we had more questions. Can we just gather the questions? Okay, yeah. Moldova?
Yes, we also have a question. You are talking about Macedonia possibly acceding to the EU in 2020. How pertinent is this situation? Because in the case when you have Brexit and the instability with the migrant crisis and so on, I don't think the question of Macedonia joining the EU is only changing the name. Like, how do you think that could be possible at this point, like in a year or so?
Okay, thank you for your question. Podgorica, you had a question.
Do you think that the protests currently happening in countries of Western Balkans are affecting process of EU integrations?
Okay, thank you for your question.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. NATO and membership of Serbia in NATO. I mean, you know, anything can happen, right? But support now is at 7%. That's an all-time low. I mean, we had higher percentages. We had 20, 30% support years ago. When this was seen, despite the memories of the bombing, as, again, part of this West, this more successful alliance, which we should try to accede to. Same as with Kosovo, same as with Russia. Narrative is what defines how the public views at something. I mean, despite our memories of 1999, it is how we speak about them 20 years later that it simply define the state of relations. It has become very difficult to change the way the public sees. I think this is because, first and foremost, there is this big stumbling block, and this is the fact that we went to war with NATO. I mean, you really can't, there is no spin that can move this question out of the, move this question from the table. And another issue is that there is absolutely, or there is very little reporting of all the positive cooperation that is happening with regard to region stability. And, we can organize dozens of events like these with the intention to get you more familiar with what Serbia does with NATO, how it cooperates with NATO today. But one headline in tabloid is more influential. It really goes down to little details. I mean, in the end of last year, NATO, for instance, was against transformation of Kosovo Security Force into a Kosovo army. And this was a difficult point for them to reach. There were disagreements within NATO itself. But when they agreed on it, they acted the way they acted. And ultimately, they didn't affect the situation on the ground. But even this NATO's opposition didn't change the public view on the alliance. I have to say, and I know this is a bit insulting from the standpoint of citizens who should be left to decide for their own. When one looks at Montenegro and how Montenegro decided to enter, it is clear that you need to have an orchestrated public campaign, and it's clear that you need to have political elite which is in favor of membership and is willing to push for it. If there is no such, same goes for European Union. I mean, when you leave people thinking about every single political alliance, political entity today is imperfect. And there are probably not more, but there are many negatives that you can identify. But you are joining because of the perceived positives. In the words of Macedonia's foreign minister, Nikola Dimitrov, it is cold outside. He uses this expression often to describe how Macedonia feels, being a small country out of North Macedonia, being a small country out of any alliance. and a country that looks to NATO as a security guarantee in terms of its borders. I think you can say the same for Bosnia. And my theory is that if there is a positive resolution between Kosovo and Serbia, and if there is, and I know how difficult this is for many in Serbia, if there is mutual recognition, this would actually ease the tensions that exist. And I believe that this would positively affect Bosnia as well. That it would change the paradigm and enable Bosnia to consider NATO membership for real. You have this ANP, the National Action Plan, and again, it is the communication between Belgrade and Banja Luka. I don't foresee in the next couple of years any meaningful change. I mean, Serbia joining NATO in the next couple of years is not a possibility. But I think that this would ease the tensions and simply start the process of deliberation. And again, it will depend on United States. I mean, it will depend on their pressure. I mean, they are the ones who are pushing for NATO enlargement and membership here more than anyone else. On North Macedonia, I was saying that North Macedonia needs to begin its negotiating process. Hopefully this year, not the next one. So membership is still years away for North Macedonia. The country that is at this particular moment most opposed to that possibility, and the country that needs to be lobbied, is France. France is opposed because of its internal considerations, because candidates of oppositions are against enlargement. I mean, Le Pen is against enlargement. Most of Eurosceptic parties are against it. There is this impression that enlargement is draining the resources of European Union, that it will threaten job security and all these things. And it's going to be very difficult. What I've been hearing is that, unfortunately, France is looking at this moment for every possible excuse. So it's not UK necessarily. I mean, it's not necessarily Brexit. It's simply internal considerations of one of the most important member states. For instance, France is really looking for every possible excuse with regard to some slight, I would say, omissions in terms of rule of law with regard to the treatment of former regime. In a country that is, I would say right now, pretty much open to ideas of democracy and liberal democracy, having been there last week. And this is going to be a great problem. And if North Macedonia, there is another question that North Macedonia is bundled together with Albania. This was done a couple of years ago in order to keep North Macedonia hopes alive, because at the time Albania was actually in front of North Macedonia as a candidate country. So this is the dynamics. I mean, for us, it is a sort of a lifeline in terms of stability, but for members, it is a question of internal policy, internal considerations, and willingness. There is definitely no more kind of willingness that we have seen some 15, 20 years ago when it comes to enlargement. But for the sake of stability of North Macedonia, its viability as a state, it's of utmost importance. And the last question with regard to protest, they are not necessarily influencing our European perspective. They are giving voice to objective dissatisfaction I think that although European Union, for the time being, especially European Commission, is saying that the dialogue should continue in the Parliament and not in the streets, concerns that were raised by people on the streets are very, very important for European perspective. They show that there is democratic potential in our societies, disregarding whether these protests will be ultimately successful or not. I mean, they show that there are thousands of people who actually care about these rules of the game, about rule of law, about equality, about many different values. And I think that you can draw comparisons, you know, with Bosnia Spring in 2014. There is arguably more comparison between what's happening in Belgrade and Podgorica than what's happening in Tirana. In Tirana, it is also a political clash that has been going for years between two major parties. But nevertheless, it is important precisely because of these autocratic tendencies. Now, there will be a lot of us who will remain pessimistic and negative if nothing comes to fruition. We have seen some of the demands, freedom of media, freedom of elections. I mean, these demands will stay even if protests fail. They will still be there. I mean, it's only, I think, a matter of time when someone else will pick them up again. And it's good that this is a constant demand coming from citizens. And if you walk the streets, at least I can say for Belgrade, in the time of protests, it's quite clear that these are protests of the middle class that is afraid, concerned, thinking about leaving, doesn't like the atmosphere in the society, doesn't like the language being used, and so on and so forth. So I do take a look at political actors who are in the second or the third row of these protests, but I don't see them as most important. Most important are citizens.
Thank you, Marko. Are there any more questions?
Yes, we actually have two questions from Bratislava.
Okay, we can hear you. Continue.
Marko, the first question, you spoke about the geopolitical implications of Serbia's and Western Balkans membership in the European Union and in NATO. But looking back at Slovakia and other Central European countries, for us the choice was not only about geopolitical implications, but also about the values, about belonging to a certain space. Does that play also a role in the thinking of the Western Balkan countries, or is it more the geopolitical implications? In other words, is it useful for us to be a member of that institution? And the second question is, looking at the trade statistics from the first half of 2018. Serbia's exports to the European Union constituted 65% of Serbia's overall trade. So you are probably nearing or reaching 2/3 of your trade with the European Union, meaning that you are already critically connected to trading with the European Union. Is it only the trading, or does it have wider implications that this is a good sign that Serbia is firmly on the road to the European Union? Are you optimistic that Serbia and other countries will join the EU?
Okay, one from Podgorica. There is some talks about among the people that the countries like Bulgaria and Romania that were early in the process, so they joined let's say early in the process, and the thing that caused was the migration of much bigger percentage of immigrants from Bulgaria and Romania in the countries of EU. That being said, I want to ask: does that problem will happen with the countries, for instance, Montenegro or Serbia, when we join the EU? Will that bring to another EU migration as we became EU's members? Will it increase the percentage of the people that will immigrate to another more developed countries in the EU after, for instance, degradation or something like that, for searching for better jobs and lives? Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Two excellent questions from Slovakia. Yes, values. This probably is the biggest problem. We have never sold to our citizens the idea of EU as community of values, despite all the efforts by civil society, think tanks, institutes, academia, and so on. There is this excellent research from 2018 done by Institute for Social Theory and Philosophy here in Belgrade, which shows that citizens perceive European Union and perceive even modern democracy primarily in terms of services that they are provided. So in a very, very material way, they don't perceive this space of personal freedom, this rule of law component, unfortunately. And this is probably part of why we see less and less support. Also, European Union is most definitely not united on some of the key issues that it is facing today. And I think that we are seeing more and more turn to national policies instead of those that were supranational. At least this is, I think this is something that is widely reported in media here. And you have to understand that media here are skeptical and are very open to contents that are Eurosceptic, NATO skeptic, enlargement skeptic, and so on. But ultimately, this is also a question for political leadership. And if we are going back to nationalism of the 1990s, if we are into the business of revision of history, it's quite clear that there is no space for European values. European values are different than that. On trade and how it has been improving and that the percentage is growing and so on, you could argue for Serbia, for instance, that we are more or less part of the production cycle of the European Union, similar to how Poland is more or less just another arm of German economy. There are companies and companies today that are being opened up that have been outsourced, that their production has been outsourced because of the price of labor, because of the state subsidies, and so on and so forth. But whether there is spillover, whether do citizens understand? I mean, if you are working in a German factory for 300 euros, because there's nothing much else to do on the labor market, you're not by definition, gratified to Germany. I mean, there are like several steps in this process, and again, it depends on free deliberation of how we discuss European Union. For instance, now European Union is discussed in very negative terms because of the perceived role with regard to Kosovo, and all of these positive, this influx, these influences are not discussed enough. I mean, there are so many examples. For instance, our research community has prospered immensely because of the availability of different EU grants like Jean Monnet and Horizon projects and so on. I mean, students have the possibility to travel and to, Erasmus is of great importance for students. I mean, I never had an opportunity to benefit from Erasmus. I mean, I had to get into a think tank in order to be able to exchange and engage with my colleagues from European Union countries and from wider Europe. Also, another problem is that we have these bloated public administrations. I mean, we have these huge public enterprises. And, there is, if we had more, if we had stronger private sector, more small and medium enterprises that have access to European Union markets, if, for instance, they would become the foundation of our economy, then you would definitely see more spillover. Then you would definitely see more sharing of this idea. However, this is still not the case. And if you work in public administration, you don't really notice the difference. It's the same for you, more or less. On to question with regard to migration, Romania, Bulgaria, and the example. Will people leave? Yes, people will most definitely leave. That's clear. I mean, Croatia is losing citizens. I mean, the numbers are alarming. Romania, which you mentioned, had 24 million inhabitants in 1989. It has 19 million today. So almost 4.5 million people left. Bulgaria has lost 1 million people. And now we look at their unemployment rates and we say, wow, those are great unemployment rates. But they are so low because people have left. I mean, this is the primary reason why. There is absolutely no way how you can prevent this. This is the catch-22 of the entire process. I mean, the very societies that we look for inspiration and knowledge and support are in the same time societies that are draining our labor force away. This is particularly true for Germany. And I don't see an easy way out of it. I mean, there's this concept of circular migration that once, I don't know, you are in, spent a couple of years in a developed, more developed country of the European Union, and you decide to go back, but then you go back to what? I mean, this is the key question. Do we enable, I mean, I look at how we enable the return of young researchers who were abroad, how we enable the return. I mean, we don't enable it. That's the question, you know. Same goes for business. Same goes for salaries, ultimately. So we will have to, I think that something that's happening in Romania might be interesting, might be of interest. But Romania has this slight advantage that it is a bigger country. It has a bigger market. Some of their data are improving. There are people who are considering to return. There are many resources that are underdeveloped. But then again, it suffers from the same problems that we all suffer. I mean, rising inequality, regional differences. I mean, there are parts that are pretty much untouched by European integration processes. So it's going to be very difficult. I mean, it's a question for you. I mean, since I have so many friends in Montenegro, I always ask myself, isn't this the one country that could benefit the most? You know, because you have this economy that's based on services. You have this fantastic potential for tourism, and you could be an example of a thriving multi-ethnic society. So I'm always asking this question to myself. I mean, for countries that are more industrial, it's bound to get more difficult. I mean, for instance, many speak of Chinese influence in this part of the world, in Serbia in particular. China bought 2 companies in Smederevo and in Bor that employ 10,000 people. So what do you do with 10,000 people? Because the approach from the West would be, it's unsustainable, you have to scale down, you have to think of another industry, of another business, and so on and so forth. This is the catch-22 that we find ourselves in.
Okay, thank you. We have, I think, 15 minutes left. So are there any more questions for Marko? Okay, Sarajevo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Savkovič, for being here with us. Lastly, but not least, I would like to ask you, what's your opinion about relationship between Bosnia and Serbia? Because obviously, this relationship is contesting the Euro-Atlantic integrations. And also what you mentioned before is a stronger communication and relationship between Banja Luka and Belgrade. And the last one is, what's your opinion about this trilateral cooperation between Turkey, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this especially road between Sarajevo and Belgrade, which can for sure benefit all of us. Thank you.
Okay. Let's say that this is a relationship that, in my view, similar as the relationship with Croatia. I mean, there is, I think, zero real need to use the narrative that is being used and to go back to revisiting our experiences of in the 1990s in the wrong way. I mean, I have to say that I was appalled by what I saw yesterday in Visegrad. Since you know, as a researcher, you have to get your facts straight and right, and you have to think of. I mean, I encourage all students to research 1990s. You know, despite the fact that it is difficult, it is far more interesting to or easier to talk about the benefits of European integration process. But we have to. I mean, and having visited Visegrad, knowing the history of the place, knowing what it means to see those people on that square after what had happened in the first half of 1990s. I mean, it's just repulsive. And the fact that there is no answer from Belgrade shows just how deep we've gone back to using these, not necessarily using these narratives. Sometimes it's enough not to respond. That sends the wrong message. I mean, and I think you have to respond immediately. Relationship with Banja Luka, it's a difficult relationship for Belgrade as well, because of its character of its current and perennial leader. I mean, Dodik has been in power for years and years. It is difficult because at the time when Belgrade is really trying not to establish a parallel with Bosnia in the case of Kosovo, Dodik is doing precisely that and making things far more complex. I mean, we need to reach some kind of historical agreement, historical understanding with Kosovo Albanians. I don't want to say Albanians because we never really had a problem with Albania as a state. It is also a new construct. But this is making matters very, very complicated, and also the kind of relationship that Russia has been building is what makes many of us who are pro-Western, and I'm pro-Western, I would say firmly in the pro-Western camp in these issues, is making us nervous. Again, let's look at economic indicators. Let's look at number of people leaving from these societies. Let's look at the future of these societies if best and brightest are leaving. And that's where the bulk of our efforts should be. I never believed. I started working as a researcher in 2005, but I was researching as a student before. I never believed that we will get to this, where we are right now. In 2005, in Belgrade media, story of the day, story of the week, story of the month was broadcasting of the video of executions in the vicinity of Srebrenica. And it was an eye-opener for many of us. 14 years later, we find ourselves in this situation. And I would say that there are deliberate attempts to revisit these places of suffering. And I have to say it happens on all sides. It happens from all sides with different intensity, but it's happening. It's happening in Croatia as well. I mean, there are some really awful examples. And I'm trying to figure out why is this necessary? And we go back to what is the foundation myth of a state. I mean, each and every state would like to keep this purity of arms concept at the very foundation of its myth. I mean, when you go to Kosovo, criticizing Kosovo Liberation Army is very difficult. You basically, you're not, I don't want to say you're not allowed to do that, but it's still considered a brave thing to do. You have examples like this all over the place. It's problem of the parties on the left side of political spectrum, which had the initiative up until 2012, 2013, 2014, that simply couldn't find the inner strength to put this question behind once and for all. And I think it is deeply problematic for Serbia as a society that wants to move forward when our prime minister gets questioned on whether it was genocide or it wasn't genocide, and she goes into deliberation on something that international court has proven and where there are sentences. So it's really disheartening how we got to this where we are right now. Part of the problem is that this is still, this exchange, this cooperation, and I think it answers the question to our colleagues from Slovakia. This is still an elite-driven project. These are elites communicating with elites. That's our problem. We don't communicate with citizens who constitute majorities in our societies. We don't. We cannot reach enough to them, and there is not enough of this whole trickling down of benefits. While I've been recently to Western Serbia, and I've literally seen a sort of a micro-region existing between Srebrenica, Bratunac, Bajina Bašta, Loznica, and these places where people communicate, cooperate, but still, unfortunately, remember the horrors of the war in a way that is just, it's not a start to build life together.
Thank you, Marko, so much. I would like to wrap this event up. I would like to thank all of the students for participating and for being active and asking questions. Also, I would like to announce that in April, at the beginning of April, we are going to have the debate in Banska Bystrica. And following that, we are going to have the meetings at the European Parliament. The students are going to present their policy briefs to the MPs, and also they are going to have the visit to the NATO HQ. So thank you, Marko. I think all of this that you shared with us is going to help students to complete their tasks and to broaden their horizons. And also, I would like to thank MESA 10 for participating, and also I would like to give a word to Milan if he wants to say something at the end.
Just thanks for everybody, and of course, Marko, thanks for your thoughtful remarks and sharing your thoughts with us. We are all looking forward to the debates of the students on April the 8th at 10 o'clock in the morning. We will communicate that on the Facebook, so everybody will know what will be happening. Thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thank you.
Siamo